Welcome to the lecture on property and methods. In this section, you will understand how you should call a variable and a function inside a class. Okay, so that's what we're going to discuss in this lecture. We'll explain what is property and methods. Okay, so let's take a step back and understand how to define a car. Then we'll try to understand what are the property and the methods. To define a car, let's say you have a Ferrari car and you want to define the elements and the action of the car. That's basically the features of a car, right? What are the elements of the car? The car could have color, it could have name, it could have, the tire, the shape of it. So there will be an elements of a car, that's a parts of the car. Then you have the action of the car. The action of the car could be start, stop, apply brakes, and all those things. Okay, so let's look at what are the elements. Elements could be name, color, size, model, type, and the car elements. It could be parts of a car, right? And the action of a car could be start the car, accelerate, brake, and etc. Right? So there are two things always assigned to an object. One is nothing but the car element, or basically elements of that object, and next is the function of that object. That could be an action of that object. In terms of the Ferrari car example, you have car elements and car actions. Car elements is name, color, and action of the car could be start the car, accelerate, and brake. Okay, this is how you define a car. Okay, so let's take this concept and understand what is property and methods. So what are properties? So here I have a class car. Just now we have defined a car class, where class is the keyword and then you have a name of the class. In this you have defined some of the variables in it, and these variables are inside the class are called as properties. They are properties because it defines the car. It is the elements of the car. That's why you call it as properties, not as variables. Variables is just variable to store something into a memory. But when it comes to a concept of classes, you're thinking in classes, you're thinking in objects. And when you think of object, you're thinking of properties and elements, right? You're not thinking about memory of, you're not thinking about variables, you're not thinking about storing the data, what type of data you're storing. You're thinking about properties. Okay? You're taking a step back and organized your code into an object and start thinking about for that object. If it's a car, what are the properties of a car? If it's a database, what are the properties? If it's a video, what could be the property? If it's a file operation, what is a property? The file operation needs a file name, right? The location of the file and what is a file name it is and where it has to operate that. Maybe it's an OS, you have a different way of operating it. Maybe it's a Windows, you different way of executing that command. So you're thinking in terms of properties, right? That's basically the elements of an object. The dollar name is basically called as property of a class. That's how you read it. You don't say dollar name variable. That's a wrong notation and wrong way of speaking in OOPS. If you have understand OOPS correctly, then you should say dollar name is a property of car class. This is how you should speak in terms of OOPS. Okay, so people will understand when you're saying dollar name is a property of a car class, you have said that car is an object and one of the feature of that car is basically the name of the car. And when you write a class, when you're writing a specification in your own words, you basically convert that into this definition. Dollar name is a property of car class. Okay, and dollar color is a property of car class. Okay, so these are properties. So from here onwards, we will not call it as variable. Okay, it is basically the property of that class. Okay, let's look at methods. For that same car, you can have methods. You can have start car, increase speed, decrease speed, and stop car. These are basically the actions of that car. The car could have actions. The files could have actions. That we have seen database also. Database has an action. Insert the records, update the records, delete the records. Those are the actions of the database. Okay, and those are definitely the functions using which you execute the code. And in OOPS, they are called as methods. So functions inside the class are called as methods. They are the action that is operating on that object. Okay, so start car is a method of car class. This is how you define it. You don't say this. You don't say start car is basically a function of a car class. You don't say function anymore, even though you define it as the function keyword, but you call it as a method because you're speaking in objects. Similarly, stop car is basically a method of a car class. Okay, so let's look at together what are property and methods. So $name is basically a property of a car class, and start car is a method of a car class. Properties help to define elements of a class. Okay, this is what we have seen previously. And methods help to perform some action in that class. The methods will use those properties to store the data, or basically to help in perform that action. Well, that's the purpose of naming it as properties and methods. They are basically elements and action of that class. Okay, so what are property and methods? If it's a database class that you have seen it previously, we just created. The DB connection and records are basically the variables, but we call it as properties. The functions that we have created are called as methods. So remember this here on, whenever you write a class, when you explain to your friends or somebody else, try to call them as properties, try to call them as methods. You will be tempted to say variables and functions because that's the mindset of a procedural language. But when you're talking about class, you should never say it as a variable. You should say it as a property. It makes more sense because it's an element of that car. It's not a variable of a car, right? It's basically a property or an element of a car. That's why you have to name it correctly. Okay, so you're learning a language here, a separate concept of OOPS, wherein you have a new lingo to speak. Okay, so remember, variables are property and functions are methods. Okay, so let's do a quick summary of what you have learned for now. You have explained what is a property and methods, and next section we're going to start writing some of the examples of property and methods. Okay, so that's all for this lecture on property and methods, and I'll see you in the next one.